There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Los Angeles is the chair of the Pan-African Studies at California State University, Melina Abdullah. With us via Skype from the University of Dayton is African history professor Julius Amin. Justin Hansford teaches law at Howard University here in Washington, D.C. and is the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Center for Civil Rights. And Stacy Hawkins focuses on civil rights and employment law as an associate professor at Rutgers University Law School. She joins us from Philadelphia. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Stacy, let me start with you. 50 years since the death of Martin Luther King. He, of course, led the fight for civil rights. But as we heard John Lewis say in that report, there are forces who want to take African Americans to another time and another place. So where is Martin Luther King's place in America right now? How is he seen?
I think he's still revered for the incredible work that he did during the civil rights movement. Obviously, he laid the groundwork for, as we heard, the election of Barack Obama, the first Black president of these United States, which was a momentous occasion that we all celebrated, particularly African Americans. But it also ushered in a new era of backlash, racial backlash, and we've not seen race relations at this heightened state for quite some time. And there are many who think that we have, in fact, regressed significantly in our journey towards daybreak, as Dr. King said, that we find ourselves deep in the dark of night yet again.
Justin, has the movement regressed?
So I think we have indeed regressed as a nation. I don't think the movement has regressed. In fact, I think a number of people in the movement have learned great lessons from Dr. King. Dr. King was an innovator in many ways, in the ways that he thought about protests, in the ways that he made a clear distinction between just and unjust laws. And he put his foot down and said that he would be willing to break unjust laws, not only in protest, but as a responsibility. He had a sense of duty to the law to make sure that, as he articulated in his letter from Birmingham jail, that he stood up for God's law, and things like the segregationist laws that were in force at the time were ungodly, and they warped the human personality. And so for those reasons, he felt justified breaking those laws, as well as lesser laws like trespass laws, which stood in the way of his ability to make change. So we've learned from his example. Our movements continue to gain from his lessons. I think that our society, in particular the United States, has regressed in its willingness to face the problems that Dr. King put his finger on. Even people like President John F. Kennedy, and after that, Lyndon B. Johnson, they spoke of the need for creating some sort of repair for the broken social contract, which is American race relations. Current president doesn't seem to see any need for such a repair, so we've taken a step back in that regard.
Right, but let's take another step back here and look at how Martin Luther King got involved in the civil rights movement in the first place, to get this into some kind of context or perspective.
Oh yeah, so Dr. King is someone who was born into a family of preachers, and if you know anything about Black American culture, the Black church has been a wellspring of leadership going back into the 19th century. Right. And so Dr. King is someone who was always born and bred to be a spokesperson and a leader. He's someone he went to Morehouse College, which is one of our illustrious historically Black colleges and universities. I'm a professor at Howard University, which I think is the best, of course. Morehouse is also one of the better historically Black colleges. And in that space, which is it's a male college, and it's a space designed to produce people like Dr. King, who would go on and see themselves as drum majors for justice, to see themselves as people who would be leaders in their respective fields and endeavors. So Dr. King comes from a community. He joined a prominent fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. He is a Black preacher in the South. He comes from a particular context which is designed to produce the type of work that he produced. Right. And so when he rose at such a young age, he benefited from Black tradition that helped to lift him up to the place where he could then perform what was his destiny.
Okay, let me bring in Melina Abdullah. Melina, Martin Luther King was a strong supporter of organized nonviolent resistance. Of course, this included things like sit-ins, protest marches, and boycotts. That philosophy was tested at times. But looking at his activity, his struggle broadly, what role did that philosophy of nonviolence play in the victories of that era?
Well, I think it's really important that we understand what nonviolence is, that he believed in nonviolent direct action. He didn't believe in sitting back and being passive. He believed that people have to confront systems of injustice, and I'm very happy. I was trying to kind of contain my excitement when I saw Justin Hansford on, who's not only a professor, but along with myself is involved deeply in the work of Black Lives Matter, the current Black Lives Matter movement. I think when we understand nonviolent direct action, we can understand the current movement as really summoning the actual tradition, the actual legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When we think about nonviolent direct action, it means not accepting unjust laws. So Justin is absolutely right. Professor Hansford is absolutely right that Dr. King said that he's not going to accept unjust laws, but he also asked all of us to challenge unjust laws. And so I think that that's the tradition that he comes from, and the work that he's done is not just work of an individual. It's important that we understand the civil rights movement, and in 1968 we had actually transitioned from the civil rights era to the Black Power era, right? And so we see also a transitioning and a growth and an evolution of Dr. King's philosophy and practice and engagement. So in 1968, he was a very different Dr. King than he was in 1963. He was a Dr. King who was preaching about the intersection of racism and capitalism, who was talking about the three evils of society: militarism, racism, and extreme materialism, who questioned whether or not, and this is a quote, America must move towards democratic socialism. And so we need to understand that Dr. King was a firm fixture, a stalwart spokesperson and stalwart organizer that was among hundreds and hundreds of others, including Ella Baker, including Septima Clark, including John Lewis, who you started off with as in a clip. And so we need to understand that that is the actual legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. compels us in the current era, if we're really to honor his legacy 50 years later, it compels us to do the work of justice.
Of course, Dr. King had an impact throughout the world. Julius, Martin Luther King was also influenced to some degree by the anti-colonial fight in Africa. The 50s and 60s were at a time when many countries in Africa were still under the yoke of colonialism. If we look at South Africa, that was where apartheid was being brutally enforced at that time. He was also admired in Africa by African leaders. What can you tell us about his international impact, especially in places in Africa?
Dr. King was outstanding in terms of his work here in the United States. And of course, his work transcended the United States boundary and went into Africa. One of the most significant things about King was his ability to empower people and his ability to understand, to make people understand that human rights represent a fundamental right that people must get and people must receive from their governments. During colonialism, he became one of the significant voices against colonialism. Dr. King went to Ghana in 1957. He was present when Ghana celebrated its independence movement. And Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to get independence. And that was the first country Dr. King went to in Africa. There in Ghana, he met Kwame Nkrumah, who had studied in the United States, who had experienced American racism, and of course, who had also understood the techniques of nonviolence. He had used nonviolence to secure independence from Ghana. So one of the things King said, especially when he came back, was that he saw in Ghana that nonviolence is very effective. And to those who were a little critical of nonviolence, King reminded them, look at Ghana, look at the example of Ghana. But again, as I said, one of the most significant things about King was this ability to empower people, to be able to demand what their rights are. And just to add something to what my co-speakers have also stated. A very significant part about King was his ability to constantly remind America that this nation was founded on the notion that all men are created equal. King frequently talked about a promissory note, that what African Americans were looking for was this promissory note. And of course, increasingly, he took this message to the world, what people in the world were looking for, this promissory note of freedom.
Right.
Especially in 1941, Roosevelt talked about the 4 freedoms, and yet many of the allies of America would continue to colonize people. King constantly said, you know what, that America must move aggressively to support decolonization. So today, King's holiday, King's memorial King is remembered not just in the United States, but in the world all over. But let me just add one more thing. In different African nations, streets, different buildings, they are named in honor of King. And that tells you how significant King was.
Stacey, just a moment ago, Justin was talking about a letter from Birmingham jail. This was something that Dr. King had written after he was arrested in 1963 for being involved in the freedom struggle. This letter became a manifesto for freedom. What can you tell us about the letter and what was in it?
Well, one of the things that I am always struck with about the letter from the Birmingham jail is when King, and I'm paraphrasing, says that really the enemy of progress is not bad people that do things. It is when good people do nothing. And so I do really think that, as everyone has said, it really is about the activism. It's really about understanding that nonviolent action is nevertheless about action, that people have to be engaged in social activism, that progress, change does not occur without struggle. And so people of goodwill and good intent have to be engaged in this fight alongside us. And I think that we are inspired by a lot of the activism that is going on, but I think one of the things that we've learned from the election of Donald Trump is that there are a lot of people who want us to believe that there are good people who nevertheless are standing by and saying that issues regarding the persecution of Muslims or issues regarding the dispelling of immigrants out of the country or racial discrimination and the brutalization of Black men is not their problem. And I think that that's what King was talking about. When people who want us to believe that they're good people stand aside and let bad things happen, that's how we fail to make the progress we are all committed to making.
Go ahead, Justin.
And I was going to add one more thing. Another significant thing to me about the letter from Birmingham jail is that the final word in the title, jail. He was in jail when he wrote that. He was arrested over 20 times. He's someone who faced physical threats almost every day of his civil rights career. When he marched in Chicago, he was hit with a brick. He had stones thrown at him. So there's a lot of glory surrounding Dr. King's legacy. Right. People like to quote the "I have a dream" speech, and this seems very flowery, and the nonviolent and peaceful nature of his vision seems to be such a beautiful experience for anyone to tap into. But for him, the experience was a struggle. It wasn't always beautiful, and it wasn't always glorious. And that's what inspires me, because many people in the Black Lives Matter movement today have faced denigration, have faced violent arrests. People have been put in jail. People have been assaulted. We see these videos and we see what is happening to everyday African Americans at the hands of the police. Dr. King faced those same things, and yet he still managed to leave a legacy that inspires us all.
Right, Melina, we see the same thing these days, decades later, don't we? The parallels are there.
Absolutely. In fact, there's something that Economic Policy Institute put out a report a couple weeks ago comparing 1968, the status of Black people in 1968 and the status of Black people in 2018. And by most measures, we've actually gone backwards. And I think that gets to the first question that you've raised. So as the movement moves forward, we're struggling hard. I think we're building something that's really powerful, and we are seeing some traction. And I think our willingness to stand up is encouraging. That said, the institutions have been stagnant. The institutions have actually are becoming more oppressive. So by most measures, Black people are doing worse now than we were doing in 1968, the year of Dr. King's assassination. If we look at household wealth, if we look at levels of incarceration, and part of what we can think about is the way in which protest and engagement has been criminalized, right? And so it has created this kind of sense of fear. It's meant to keep us quiet. It's meant to make us think that all Dr. King ever did was deliver a beautiful, like Justin said, a flowery I have a dream speech, and they always play the flowery clip. They don't ever play, you know, the piece of that same speech that says that we can never be satisfied as long as Black people face the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. That is from I Have a Dream in 1963. That's before he kind of stepped into his fully radicalized self. And so I think that we need to unearth the authentic, the genuine legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, and on this 50-year anniversary, be willing to move forward and push those institutions and push those systems to change, be more committed to the movement now than ever. Dr. King also said this is a long and bitter but beautiful struggle, and so we have to embrace the beauty of the struggle and step into it as our sacred duty.
Justin, if we look at the history of that time, I want to get back to the speech, the I Have a Dream speech, a famous speech from Martin Luther King, of course. It was preceded by the March on Washington. Hundreds of thousands of people took part in that march. Did that mark a turning point in the struggle?
Oh, definitely. That year, we have the march, we have the speech, we have these videos being circulated around the world of young people being assaulted and having dogs sicked on them by police officers. Bull Connor was instituting some of the harshest enforcement of police brutality that we've seen videotaped up into that time. And similar to today, where we see the videotapes of police killing and harming and maiming Black citizens, I think the world saw it for probably the first time via video in 1963, and very shortly thereafter, 1964, we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. 1965, we have more civil rights, voting rights bills passing, but there had been action since the beginning of the sit-ins in the early part of the 1960s. Right. And of course, the Montgomery bus boycott as early as 1954, where King got his start along with Rosa Parks. But 1963 was a turning point where the visuals really made an impact and helped to push forward the movement, which resulted in the passing of laws shortly thereafter.
Julius, I want to get back to the international impact again, and you have written that Martin Luther King forced society to reflect on issues of social justice and white privilege. It was a message that resonated with contemporary African society. How was that message heard in Africa?
One of the most significant things, again, as I said, I cannot underscore this often enough. The ability to empower people, the movement here in the United States was very influential to the movement in Africa because a lot of young people, again, became mobilized, took to the streets and began to challenge injustice, both at the political and economic level. One of the most fundamental challenges in African countries today is that leadership continues to be in the hands of a chosen few. The economic system continues to be hijacked by a chosen few. And there's a sense of social decay. And many of these people, many of the young people, were able to look at King's work. Because when King, for example, was assassinated, King was dealing with issues of economic justice, issues of human rights. He had moved away from civil rights and increasingly was talking about human rights. And so what you find here in many African countries, this is what people are talking in the streets today, that what is taking place is not an issue of just some kind of rights, but human rights. Human rights are crucial. The right to education, the right to food, the right to clean water. So King's message continues to influence the people in Africa. And one of the fundamental things I had also written in the past was that it would be important for African leaders, especially now, to go back and reread King's I Have a Dream speech, especially the section where King talks about the urgency of now, the urgency of the moment, because there are so many issues taking place which clearly King already provided a roadmap towards that.
Stacy, where does Dr. King's struggle go to from here, from now on?
So one of the things, as I was reading back over the mountaintop speech, which was the speech he gave the evening before he was assassinated, before he was going to have the jobs march with the sanitation worker, the labor strike, he was talking about the need for not only collective action, but for leveraging the economic power of the Black community. And that's one of the things that I think has been under-realized. We have seen that tactic work, but for instance, most recently with respect to the Colin Kaepernick and the attempt to kind of black out the NFL, we've had kind of fits and starts with this kind of work. We saw Jesse Jackson do it quite effectively back in the 90s with respect to boycotting Coca-Cola around their racial discrimination lawsuit. And so we know that this can be highly effective. We see when advertisers pull their support based on content that they think is inappropriate, it actually moves the needle in terms of making some measurable progress in the public dialogue, but also in getting things done. So I think I was really inspired and reminded that, he was talking about at the time that the Black American economic power was larger than all but 9 states around the world, right? It was larger than the United States kind of exports, that we have immense collective power, and that when we bring that power to bear on the issues that are important to us, we can have a real significant and tangible impact on those issues that we want to advance.
Melina, I've only got 40 seconds. You played an instrumental role in the establishment of the Black Lives Matter movement. Does that pick up the mantle now from where Dr. King left it?
I think so. I think we absolutely, it's our intention to pick up that mantle, the mantle of radical resistance, the understanding that the world has to be transformed, the recognition that Black lives absolutely have to matter. As the bottom of pretty much every economic, social, and political measure, we understand that when Black people rise, we all rise. And so it's our intention to absolutely summon the work and the energy of Dr. Martin Luther King and of all of those who struggled for the justice and freedom of Black people, and intentionally say the names of those who've been lost. So today we are also lifting up the spirit of Stephen Clark, who was murdered in Sacramento earlier, March 18th.
Right.
And so we want to lift up his name as well as all of those whose bodies have been stolen by the state.
And that's where we have to leave a thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We leave you with the words of Martin Luther King Jr. and the music of John Legend and Common from the motion picture Glory. I'm Arlen Gnaidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.
And when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. We cry.